Hi everyone, my name is Kinjia Munkara-Murray. I'm a proud Tiwi and Rembarrnga woman. I grew up in Darwin and I now live in Melbourne. And I'm an ecologist and an entomologist. I have a background in science, both in traditional science and also Western science methods. I work with traditional owners in the water space and especially water ecology as well. So that's a bit of background about me. The DNA is like the building blocks for life, right? It's the blueprint that we use. That's what tells the body how something should be made and how something should be, should function and be maintained. So when you have something like a mutation, so the facial tumor disease that Tassie devils are afflicted by, that disease has undergone multiple mutations. And so that results in different impacts on the Tassie devil population. So I think it's important to understand the role of DNA in mutations or how mutations function, because that's how we can address sort of changing things like changes in diseases. Even with something like COVID, we know that COVID underwent multiple different mutations and is still mutating to this day in different varieties. And by understanding that those mutations happen on a very, very basic fundamental level, that happens in the DNA. Certain aspects of our DNA, some parts get turned on, others get switched off. Environmental factors can cause mutations. All of these things filter down to have an impact on those very basic building blocks of life. So I'll give an overview of genetic diversity and understanding DNA. And then I have two examples to sort of highlight the importance of understanding DNA. And that's with talking about Tassie devils and the facial tumor disease, and also by talking about invasive ants and how they can threaten island ecosystems. So if we go to the next slide, what is DNA? So DNA actually stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but DNA is pretty much just a set of instructions or a blueprint for building and maintaining an organism. So every living thing has DNA. And this contains the genetic information that determines traits like eye color, height, hair color, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. And DNA works, it's in the sense that it's sort of shaped like a double helix, which kind of looks like a twisted ladder to some people. And the base pairs are the rungs of the ladder. So each rung of the ladder is made of a pair of chemicals that we call bases. So adenine with thymine, and cytosine with guanine. And we refer to sections of DNA as genes. And each gene carries the instructions for making a specific protein that does a particular job in the body. So moving to the next slide, what is genetic diversity? Well, genetic diversity refers to a variety of genes within a species. So it's pretty much, it's what makes individuals within a species different from each other in terms of appearance, behavior, and other traits. So when you think about cats or dogs or even apples, they all come from the same species. These are all the same species. They just have great genetic diversity that results in different colors and different sort of appearances and stuff like that. So high genetic diversity means there is a wide range of different genes in the population, while low genetic diversity means that genes are more similar. Right, so now I'm going to talk to you a bit more about Tassie devils and the facial tumor disease. So Tasmanian devils are a type of carnivorous marsupial that are found in Tasmania. And unfortunately, they are facing a serious threat from a disease called devil facial tumor disease. And this disease is a type of cancer that causes large tumors to form on the face and inside the mouth of Tassie devils. And these tumors can interfere with eating, and it eventually leads to starvation and death. And this cancer is spread in a way that's not like what you would think of with cancer, normal cancer, like other cancers, like ones that humans are faced with. So this type of cancer is contagious. So it actually spreads from one Tassie devil to another through biting, which is super common with this species because they are always fighting over food or mates. And the cancer cells themselves pass along, effectively sort of transplanting the tumor from one devil to another. And the tumor cells in the cancer actually have their own DNA. And this is different from the DNA of the Tassie devils, the hosts that they infect. When a devil gets bitten, it doesn't just get an infection, it gets the actual cancer cells that then multiply in the new host, because cancer cells multiply. And this is actually possible because the cancer cells are able to avoid the immune system of the new host. That's how they multiply over time. So moving on to the next slide, there's an interesting impact that islands have when it comes to genetic diversity. So Tassie devils, they live on Tassie, that's an island. It's fully surrounded by water and isolated from the mainland. And now this has some important effects on Tassie devils. Since Tassie devils can only live on this one island, they don't have the ability to move to new areas to escape threats or find new resources. So this means they have limited habitat. And islands typically have smaller populations of animals compared to larger land masses. And this is true for Tassie devils. So there are fewer individuals and a much lower population. And so with a smaller population comes low genetic diversity. So we're talking before about high genetic diversity and low genetic diversity. There is much less genetic diversity among Tassie devils. So they're more closely related to each other than other animals in larger, more diverse populations. So how does living on an island actually impact the disease they're faced with? Well, there are several impacts that have an influence on the spread and severity of facial tumor disease among Tassie devils. One of the impacts is close contact. Because this population is confined to such a limited area, Tassie devils come into contact with each other more often. This close contact makes it easier for the facial tumor disease to spread because, the disease is spread through biting and they're constantly coming across each other. So close contact has an impact there. And once this disease appears in one part of the island, it can really quickly spread to other areas because these Tassie devils don't have anywhere else to go. They can't migrate to new territories to escape that disease. And with low genetic diversity, there's less chance, you can say, that individuals have natural resistance to this disease. In larger populations with more genetic variety, some animals might have genetic traits that help them to resist or survive the disease. But on an island with low diversity, this is less likely. So why is this important to understand DNA? The reason that it's important is because this is how scientists can develop strategies to protect endangered species like Tassie devils. By studying the genetic makeup of the devils and the tumor cells that they're afflicted with, researchers can look for ways to prevent the spread of the disease, possibly through vaccines and other treatments. However, there are some conservation challenges. On Tassie, it's really challenging to isolate healthy populations from infected populations of Tassie devils to prevent the spread of this disease. I believe they've even tried transplanting or translocating healthy populations onto smaller islands off of the coast of Tassie to try and set up new populations that haven't been impacted yet. But yeah, so scientists and conservationists have to work extra hard to protect Tassie devils. So this includes efforts like breeding programs where healthy devils are bred in captivity and then they are released into the wild in safe areas, like those islands that are off the coast that haven't been affected yet. Conservation efforts are really crucial to ensure that Tassie devils can survive and thrive despite the challenges that they face. Right, so then my second example is talking about invasive ants. So what are invasive species? Invasive species refers to plants, animals, or other organisms that are introduced to a new environment where they don't naturally belong. They can cause problems by competing with native species for resources, by spreading diseases, and by disrupting local ecosystems. And the ways that we can identify invasive species is through one way is actually through DNA analysis. So for example, by studying the DNA of ants, scientists can identify which species are invasive and where they came from, because DNA can provide a genetic fingerprint that helps to distinguish between native and invasive species. And knowing the genetic makeup of an invasive ant species can reveal where it originated, which can help in developing strategies to control its spread. So an example of invasive ant species is the yellow crazy ant. We have it in Australia in multiple locations, and they have also been found on Christmas Island. So they are highly invasive and also highly disruptive. And by studying their DNA, scientists have been able to find out where they originated from, and also how they may have arrived on Christmas Island. And scientists are also able to study the DNA to help develop specific ways to control these ants based on their specific genetic weaknesses without harming other species. So we talked about the impact that being on an island has for Tassie devils. Now we'll talk about the impact that being on an island has for ants, for example. So ants on an island, geographically isolated from other populations. So we know they're going to be cut off from other groups of ants and they can't easily mix with them. They can't easily, increase that genetic diversity. Ants on the mainland can move freely over large areas. They're mixing with different populations. They're acquiring new genes into their populations, increasing that genetic diversity. And as we said before, populations of ants on islands are much smaller because the area is limited. So less area also means smaller populations, which means less genetic diversity. There's also something that we call the founder effect, which I probably should have put something on the slide, I just realized. But the founder effect is something where when a new population of ants is founded on an island, it often begins with a small group of individuals called the founders, and the genetic diversity of this new population depends on the genes of those initial founders. So if they don't carry a wide range of genes, the genetic diversity will always be low. It'll always be representative of that first group of founding ants. So gene flow is what we call the movement of genes between populations. So on an island, gene flow is restricted, of course, because ants don't have any other populations to mix with on an island. But on the mainland, you get a lot of gene flow because ants are able to mix with other groups to increase that genetic diversity. So why is genetic diversity important for island ants? Well, high genetic diversity allows a species to adapt to changes in the environment, such as new predators, diseases, climate change, or even invasive species of ants as well. This is what makes a population more resilient. And with low genetic diversity, a population is more vulnerable to being wiped out by a single disease or environmental change because they're all genetically similar and might all be equally susceptible. So it's really important to have higher genetic diversity where possible. So why is understanding DNA and genetics important in a case like this? Well, it's important because that's how we can help to identify invasive species by studying the DNA of ants and understanding where they come from by tracking that genetic fingerprint that helps to distinguish between native and invasive species. It's also important because by studying DNA, we can understand behavior. So we can understand certain genetic traits that invasive ants may have that make them more aggressive or better at finding food or more resilient to local conditions. And by studying these traits, scientists can predict how invasive species might behave and impact an island's ecosystem. This also helps to tell us a bit more about how well they may adapt. Invasive species can sometimes adapt quickly to new environments. So understanding their genetics helps predict how they might evolve and change over time on the island. And all of this information helps to develop control strategies. So genetic information can help develop targeted methods to control invasive ant populations. So scientists can use that knowledge to create specific baits or specific biological controls that only affect the invasive species without harming native ants. And as an example, there's actually some types of parasitic fly that only target certain species of ants in other countries. So scientists have done research on them and trying to see, is there some way we can like genetically modify this fly to only attack, yellow crazy ants, things like that. That's the sort of stuff that scientists are working on. But yeah, also developing control strategies also helps to prevent the spread. So by understanding the genetic pathways, that genetic footprint of how invasive ants are spreading, scientists can use that to implement measures to prevent further invasion. So this can include quarantine procedures or even sort of habitat management. And all of these conservation efforts can go towards protective native species. So by understanding the genetics of both invasive and native ant species, that's how we're going to best develop conservation strategies that protect our native flora and fauna, and also to protect their habitat from being overrun by invasive species. Cool. So to conclude, I think it's important to say that understanding DNA and genetics in Australia is crucial for several reasons. One is that Australia's unique biodiversity is facing risks from invasive species and diseases, and genetic research can help us to understand the genetic diversity within populations, which is going to be essential for their resilience and long-term survival in the face of disease, invasive species, climate change. It's also important for things like disease management. So for diseases like the facial tumor disease, genetic understanding allows us to study how disease spreads, its genetic makeup, and the factors that influence susceptibility and resistance, such as in Tassie devils. This knowledge is vital for developing effective conservation strategies. It's also important in regards to invasive species control. So for something like the yellow crazy ant, which we already have in Australia, we need to find ways to manage it. Invasive species are just significantly disruptive to our ecosystems. So doing genetic studies on these invasive species is going to help us to create targeted control measures. Another impact of researching genetic diversity is to understand ecosystem health in Australia. So by studying the genetics of various species, we can monitor ecosystem changes and the impact of environmental stresses, which can help to maintain and restore healthy ecosystems in the long run. And another impact as well is to better develop breeding programs. So with something like Tassie devils, if we want to ensure that we have healthy populations that have developed resistance to disease, we need to develop appropriate breeding programs that fully understand their genetic variability and susceptibility to certain diseases, and how to breed for stronger Tassie devils. And lastly, adaptation to climate change. It's a very topical area of research, and genetic research can really identify traits that enable species to adapt to our changing environmental conditions. And this is really crucial work in the face of climate change. This information can guide conservation efforts to support adaptive capacity in wildlife populations. The main drivers of the breeding programs for Tassie devils involves finding healthy, unaffected populations and translocating them to areas that are free from the disease. So there are a couple of islands off the coast of Tasmania that have been identified as suitable translocation sites. And what scientists can do is breed up healthy Tassie devils in these locations, or even within the breeding programs of wildlife parks and zoos. And they are able to breed up healthy populations and simultaneously also do research on what genes Tassie devils have that can make them stronger and more able to resist the facial tumor disease. So that requires a lot of detailed work on what parts of the genes are actually being affected by this disease. How can we make those parts of the gene stronger that's the sort of question, and other questions like that that scientists are faced with. Oh, I love that. Yes. So I had a very interesting relationship with science where I've always loved nature. Like ever since I was a little girl, I was always out there in the backyard or in the tropics of, Darwin looking for insects and reptiles and all kinds of animals. So I always loved it. But going through school, I always had this feeling like, oh, I'm not smart enough to study science. Like I just didn't have that self-confidence. And even when I got to university, I actually started studying in a Bachelor of Arts. I loved science. It was always my hobby, my interest, but I was like, oh, I'm not smart enough to do that. And it wasn't until I had completed a couple of years of my Bachelor of Arts where I thought, this just really isn't for me. Like, I'm just really not enjoying this. And I ended up actually changing into a Bachelor of Science. And that was like mind blowing. I just loved it from the get go. And it took me a little bit to build my skills up in certain areas. But after I did that, I just flourished. And I think me flourishing in that science degree was proof to me that, this is what I was meant to be doing. Especially because talking about like my mentors, the people who really sort of impacted me, my mother and my grandmother are also strong scientists and strong ecologists. It's interesting because as I was doing this science degree, right, I'm here and I'm learning about this stuff and I'm realizing, hey, my family already know this stuff. We already do this stuff. We just call it something different. So my grandmother who came before me, she loved birds. Like she was just mad about birds. That was her thing, And then same with my mum. My mum just loved animals. And now I love animals. So my grandmother and my mother are my mentors. They were the first scientists in my family before me. And then our ancestors before them as well were the first scientists in our family. So they've always been my mentors that I hold close to my heart. One, we've been here for thousands and thousands of years. Two, we've successfully passed on the knowledge and information that our people have learned. We've passed this information on for those thousands and thousands of years. So that continuity of information and the long time that we've had to apply the scientific method of research to our environment, because that's what we've done. The scientific method, observation, experimentation, research, all that sort of stuff, we did that. We've done that for thousands of years and we passed that on. And that is probably the biggest strength that we have when it comes to answering questions regarding the environment in the Australian context, especially with something like climate change. Traditional knowledge holders, we need to have a voice in the discussion and at the table when it comes to talking about climate change because of that long history of scientific knowledge that we have. Us mob, we used the environment in a way that would best sort of play to our strengths, but then the environment and the country around us used us as well to bring out the best aspects of that country. We nurtured country to become the best it could be. Country nurtured us to become the best that we can be. So, it's a real reciprocal sort of relationship, I believe. Yeah. If there's any kids that are interested in working in science, probably the biggest challenge that they're going to face is one that I also face, which is feeling, like you're not confident enough or good enough to do that or to study that, because, I guess the whole point of DeadlyScience is you might be trying to change that perception that, science isn't something separate to us and, traditional knowledge and all of that sort of stuff. So we need to have more mentors, we need to have more Indigenous scientists that we are showing to these young kids and showing them that you can be that. That's in your blood. If you want to be that, you can do that. So I think if kids want to move into science, I think, I want to say like they need to like pretty much just like stamp all over those feelings inside them that are telling them that they're not good enough, because they are 100% good enough. They are 100% smart enough to study science if they want to. Get that strength from your family and from your ancestors. Let your family push you to be the best version of yourself that you want to be. I think that's the important thing is, draw on the strength of your ancestors.